Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast. AI and Architectural Design. Chapter 4, Between Control and Surrender. Who designs the design? In the previous chapter, the prompt was reframed as a new form of concept, not a preliminary note, but an active site where intention is articulated and direction is set. Designing was no longer understood as beginning with form, but with the structuring of thought through language. The process unfolded through prompts and responses, iterations and adjustments. But once design begins through interaction rather than declaration, a new question inevitably emerges. Who is actually in control of the process? And more precisely, who designs the design? In traditional architectural practice, control has always been a central, if often unspoken, assumption. The designer is positioned as the author, the one who directs the process from idea to outcome. Even when collaboration is involved, the structure of authorship tends to remain intact. Decisions are made, refined, and executed within a framework where intention flows in a relatively clear direction. The process may be complex, but it is rarely ambiguous in terms of control. Artificial intelligence disrupts this clarity. When a prompt is introduced into the system, it does not produce a single, predictable outcome. It generates variations, multiple possible directions that extend beyond the initial intention. The response is neither entirely controlled nor entirely random. It occupies an intermediate space. The designer initiates the process, but does not fully determine its trajectory. The result is not a direct translation of thought into form, but a negotiation between intention and generation. This negotiation introduces a tension that is both productive and destabilizing. On the one hand, it allows unexpected ideas to emerge. Variations that might not have been consciously conceived become available for consideration. The process expands. On the other hand, it challenges the traditional sense of authorship. If a system beyond direct control partially shapes the outcome, the designer's role must be reconsidered. Control, in this context, does not disappear. It shifts. It moves from direct execution to selective direction. The designer no longer determines every aspect of the outcome, but determines which outcomes are pursued, refined, or abandoned. The act of design becomes less about producing form and more about navigating possibilities. Selection replaces certainty as the central operation. This shift requires a different kind of engagement. Instead of seeking complete control over the process, the designer must develop an ability to operate within uncertainty. This does not mean surrendering intention, but recalibrating it. Intention becomes a guiding force rather than a fixed instruction. It sets boundaries, defines criteria, and establishes a direction, but it does not prescribe every detail. At the same time, the presence of AI-generated variation introduces a new form of temptation. The availability of multiple options, produced rapidly, can create the illusion of progress. Movement is mistaken for development. The process appears active but may lack depth. Without a clear framework for evaluation, the designer risks becoming passive, accepting outputs rather than interrogating them. This is where critical judgment becomes central. If control is no longer exercised through direct production, it must be exercised through decision-making. Each output must be read, assessed, and positioned within a broader conceptual framework. Why this option and not another? What direction does it suggest? What does it obscure? The process demands a level of attentiveness that cannot be automated. The tension between control and surrender is therefore not a binary condition. It is not a question of either controlling the process or relinquishing it entirely. It is a dynamic balance. Too much control may restrict exploration, reducing the system's potential to a mere extension of existing ideas. Too much surrender may dissolve direction, leading to outcomes that lack coherence or intention. The challenge lies in maintaining a position between these extremes. This intermediate position redefines authorship. The designer is no longer the sole originator of form, but neither is the system an independent creator. The design emerges through interaction. Authorship becomes distributed, but not equal. The system generates possibilities. The designer assigns value. The authority of the designer is not diminished, but relocated. This relocation has implications beyond the individual project. It affects how design is understood as a discipline. If the process is no longer linear and controlled from start to finish, then design cannot be reduced to a sequence of steps. It becomes a field of negotiation, where decisions are made in response to evolving conditions. The role of the designer shifts from executing a predefined plan to managing a dynamic process. In the design studio, this shift becomes particularly visible. Students working with AI often encounter moments of uncertainty. The system produces unexpected outputs, sometimes compelling, sometimes irrelevant. The initial reaction may be to either accept or reject these outputs quickly, but the real value lies in engagement. Why does a particular variation appear convincing? What assumptions does it carry? How does it relate to the initial prompt? These questions transform the process from one of consumption to one of reflection. The student is no longer a passive recipient of generated images but an active participant in their evaluation. The design process becomes a conversation, not only between the human and the system, but also within the designer's own thinking. This conversational model of design challenges the notion of control as dominance. Control is no longer about imposing form, but about sustaining coherence. It is about maintaining a trajectory within a field of possibilities. The designer does not dictate every move, but ensures that the process does not lose direction. At a broader level, this condition reflects a shift in how creativity is understood. Creativity has often been associated with originality and individual expression. With AI, curation and synthesis become more closely linked. The ability to navigate, select, and transform becomes as important as the ability to generate. The creative act is distributed across stages of interaction. This does not diminish the role of the designer. On the contrary, it intensifies it. The presence of multiple possibilities increases the need for discernment. The designer must define criteria, establish priorities, and make decisions that give coherence to the process. Creativity becomes less about producing something entirely new and more about shaping what emerges. If the prompt initiates the process, then control determines its direction. But control, in this context, is not absolute. It is negotiated. It is exercised through engagement rather than imposition. The design does not simply follow intention, it evolves through interaction. This brings us back to the central question of this episode. Who designs the design? The answer is not singular. The design is not produced by the system alone, nor by the designer in isolation. It emerges through a relationship defined by prompts, responses, selections, and revisions, a relationship in which control is continuously adjusted. If there is a risk in this condition, it is not the loss of control, but the illusion of it. The process may appear manageable while underlying decisions remain unexamined. The designer may believe control is maintained, while in reality direction has been diffused. Recognizing this requires a conscious engagement with the process. In the next chapter, we will move from this tension between control and surrender to examine the deeper structures that shape AI-generated outputs, the layers of style, memory, and bias embedded within the system. The discussion will shift from interaction to influence, from decision-making to the hidden frameworks that guide those decisions. Because once control is understood as negotiation, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly are we negotiating with? And how do the histories embedded within AI shape the possibilities we encounter? This concludes Chapter 4 of AI and Architectural Design. Between control and surrender, who designs the design? Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.